From religion to wrestling, gumbo to grits, politics to poetry, and all things Southern in between, this is Take on the South. Produced by the Institute for Southern Studies and hosted by the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of South Carolina, Take on the South examines the highs and lows of the American South, examines the truths and fictions of the country's most distinctive region, and picks the brains of some of its most accomplished students. To understand the South, you need to take it on, and that's what we'll be doing. Join us as we take on the South.
Hi, listeners. Welcome to Take on the South, the podcast of the University of South Carolina's Institute for Southern Studies. I am one of the hosts, Emily Allen, and I'm excited to share with you one of my conversations about music, history, and culture of the South. So our guest for today is Dr. Simon Buck, a writer, historian, and musician. And his first monograph, which I'm really looking forward to reading, is about old age and music in the U.S. South, and it's under contract with the University of Illinois Press. Currently, he is employed at the University of Edinburgh on research projects concerning the intersection of British slavery, healthcare, and university education in Edinburgh. So thanks for joining us today, Simon.
Thanks very much for having me.
Yeah. And so just to give our readers a little bit of kind of background here, can you tell us about yourself and how you came to do this work on music and old age in the South?
Thanks. Yeah. So I'm born in the UK. I was born in a city called Leicester in the middle of England, and like many Brits, have a certain fascination with the American South for various reasons, and one of those reasons is cultural, of course, and musical. And as I learned to play music, I'm a pianist. I became fascinated with blues piano, boogie woogie piano, and I've always played in different blues groups from a relatively young teenage age until today. I still play music where I can. And I suppose the project and my interest in the relationship between Southern music and old age is arriving from a kind of personal experience, I suppose. I have one anecdote that really is the driving force behind all of this research, which is that I was just playing a gig in Leicester, or maybe London, in fact, and somebody came up to us afterwards and said, "Oh, you were a blues band," and he said, "You guys are really good. But the thing is, you're not really old enough to play the blues, are you? Because we were all kind of, late teens or early 20s. And I thought it was an interesting comment to make, A, because I'm British, not from the southern states, B, because I'm white, and C, I just thought it was interesting that the old age was more important than any of those things. And I think that for blues music in particular, which was how this kind of project started, there is a kind of social cultural imaginary about the genre that has this image of older, often male, often black guitarists, and that is the way the genre is understood. Despite, and if you're a fan of the blues, you'll be familiar that particularly in the early era of recorded phonograph blues in the 20s and 30s, it was a lot of younger musicians. Robert Johnson was very young. Yet the blues revival of the post-war period really shifted that understanding. So it was through that, and then I decided eventually. I used to work for an oral history archive, which was another interesting connection here, because I used to interview a lot of older people talking about the local past. And once I'd wrapped up with that job, I decided to do an MRes, which was looking primarily at this question of the blues revival, particularly the transatlantic element here as well, because you often had young, like myself at the time, younger white British fans interacting, being fans of older black musicians in the 50s and 60s. So that was a big part of it. And then I followed that up with a PhD where I expanded that to look more at roots music, broadly understood in the US South, so that as well as blues and other black associated musics in the South. That took in country music, hillbilly music, old time music, and other kinds of folk music in the South. So I'm kind of building on that PhD project to make the book. And I suppose that a lot of part of that PhD project was understanding that there are these two kinds of disciplines, Southern studies and age studies. And my humble contribution, I suppose, was to try to bring these two different scholarly worlds into conversation with another, that old age has a history in the South that kind of needs to be studied a little bit more.
Actually, recently, in one of my classes, my students and I worked through one of your pieces that is kind of a sliver of this. It was your spring 2023 Southern Cultures article. So, and they were really struck by that reading. And I think it was a really great case study for what Southern studies can do when we think about things through an age studies lens that you're getting at there. I think you're on the right track for sure with bringing those fields together. You're doing a lot of different stuff. So the purposes of this conversation, I'm thinking we can maybe focus on that piece. For listeners, just for context, the name of this article that he wrote in the Southern Cultures, which is a journal, is up on Cripple Creek, Limb Loss, Difference, and Disability Spectacle in Southern Roots Music. So kind of looking at the latter phase of your work there in terms of roots music. And then you were talking about Southern studies and age studies, but I think there's a third tier that we should unpack for a minute here just for our listeners so they kind of know where we're going with this, which is disability studies. Can you talk about this relationship between age studies and disability studies? And how do you feel like you're engaging with both of those areas in that Southern Cultures article?
Yes. So, I mean, disability studies is a really interdisciplinary field. It takes in quite a few different things. I work mostly in the history of disability, but there's also kinds of, English literature, musicology, all these different fields will interact with it to a certain degree. Historically, it emerges, I suppose, you have to really center it in the disability rights movement of the sort of late 20th century in particular. Which is, advanced social justice issues for disabled people with disabilities. And a big part of that movement and the kind of scholarly element of that movement, which came out of it, is this idea that there is a social or cultural model of disability, but disability, while there are kind of biomedical factors that are a big part of disability, that are real and have a real effect on your life, there is also the way in which you are disabled by the ableist society that we live in, that the disadvantages, so to speak, that you may have as a disabled person come from obstructions in that society. We might think about wheelchair users not being able to have access to a building because there's no ramp. That's not necessarily a factor of their disability. It's a factor of the fact the building doesn't have a ramp. It's a very simple example, but it shows you what we're kind of talking about. And so a big part of that scholarly field is to unpack and challenge these kind of harmful tropes about disability. And I really do mean harmful because, the extreme end of this, we're talking about things like eugenics and all kinds of obstructions for getting benefits that can cause people physical pain, hunger, even death. So these are quite serious issues. It's more than just stereotypes in the lightest sense of the word. And another part of all that kind of that field, and this is particularly in terms of the history of sort of studies of the history of disability, is celebrating and uncovering the lives of disabled people and amplifying their voices from the past. It's a big part, and there's a lot of comparisons here with Black studies, LGBTQIA+, all these kinds of ways of understanding the lives of marginalized people in the past. That's definitely been a part of it, is to understand the lives of disabled people. Now, in the South, disability studies kind of intersects with kind of a web of historical context, which people familiar or sort of studying the South will know a bit about. And in particular, we're thinking about social injustices relating to class, race, and gender. And so loads of studies have been made about the relationship between disability and the Civil War, Confederate soldiers, Confederate veterans, also disability and healthcare in the South. Historically, healthcare, particularly in the 19th and 20th centuries, and even up to the present day, there are all kinds of inequalities in healthcare that exist that are very acute in the South. If you look at maps of health inequalities, the South is often the reddest part of it, and different states. You might highlight Mississippi being a good example of one of those states. And then I suppose another big field in all of that is the relationship between disability, health, and racial segregation, and particularly civil rights movement activities around healthcare and disability across the 20th century. So that's a big part of it. And I suppose another thing that comes into my research is that relationship between poverty and rural life and disability and various accommodations that have to happen for disabled people to live and thrive in rural circumstances where, for example, state support isn't there as readily as it might be in urban northern settings, for example. So that's, I suppose, how Southern studies and disability studies kind of come together. The third element there of age studies in that kind of three-part union of scholarly disciplines there is is that it's very much like disability studies model. So it comes out of this age justice kind of movement. So you have, for example, bodies like the Grey Panthers in the 1970s coming into being in America that are fighting for the justice of older people. Often this is to do with issues such as healthcare, pensions, workplace rights, all of these kinds of issues, and also working against cultural stereotypes. So the political activism is a big part of the discipline, and a big feature of this kind of scholarly movement is that old age has often been considered as something of a disability. So while aging is, again, like disability, somewhat of a biomedical phenomenon, it also has large and quite impactful cultural dimensions. So, we might think about the associations we have of older people are often things like walking canes, hearing aids, bowel movements, even. All of these kinds of things that are associated with older age are often to do with physical conditions. But there is a difference, I suppose, and this is something that we have to pull out when we're thinking about, are we talking about age or disability here, is that a more unique part of age studies is how older people are often associated with lived experience. I mean, age is nothing but embodied experience, right? The experiences you gain over a lifetime. So while disabling conditions and these other things are relevant, things such as memory, cultural traditions, as I said, lived experience and wisdom all come into this package. And what some age study scholars will call elderhood, this state of being an elder, and what does it mean in different cultures and societies, is a big part of all this. So to sort of connect all those three different things, there's two demographics that I look at a lot in my work, which is older, formerly enslaved people of African descent, and the other will be equally elderly Confederate veterans, who represent, although very different demographics for obvious reasons, represent the difficulties of working in this kind of nexus of age, disability, and Southern identity. Because on the one hand, these are people that are reached out to for their memories and lived experiences and traditions, but not least musical tradition, but for whom also are people that are living with the realities, the biomedical realities of older age, whether that's memory loss, physical debilities, fatigue, and as we're going to be talking about, things such as long life disabilities. So these three different worlds are similar. There's similar things going on there about identity, different power structures, but at the same time, they have something to say to each other. So that's the kind of juggling act that I'm trying to do in my research.
Yeah, thank you. I think that helps a lot with listeners who may not be as familiar with these subfields and like how those can be in conversation with each other. And I kind of want to tease out for a second one of the case studies you were kind of mentioning there in your introduction that you also discuss in this Southern Studies piece, which was the Confederate veteran fiddling contest, for instance. And you were saying that's part of your work. And when you were talking about memory, I was thinking about some of the things like the lost cause narratives that you tease out in the Southern Cultures piece. Can you tell us a little bit about those fiddling competitions that you unpack in the Southern Cultures article?
Yes. So fiddlers contests, which are a bit of a general explanation for those who aren't familiar with the tradition. It's an old kind of musical folk tradition that can be found in Europe, in Scandinavia, in Ireland in particular, and then obviously migrated across the Atlantic at various stages along with the fiddle. Now, there are difficult events to describe, but they are essentially these competitions between fiddlers, and often those competitions were not particularly serious, just a form of light entertainment in a local community, in a local town hall, courthouse, but often they were also quite serious competition, reasonably large prizes as well. So they range in their nature and kind of scope across, and size even. Sometimes there's a couple of handful, and sometimes there's dozens and dozens of performers. So that's the general tradition. And what I talk about in my research is a particular kind of a version of that called the Old Fiddlers Contest, which were events that were age restricted, and they had a kind of upper age or lower, depending on your perspective, age restriction. So you had to be, say, over 65 to be able to enter some of these contests. So there were real spaces, we might call them now, if you think about Florida, for example, these kind of age restricted communities, kind of this kind of cultural event we're talking about. And they became particularly popular in the South, kind of around the 1890s, beginning of the 20th century. And that really, it's not a coincidence, I'm arguing, that it happens during that period for various reasons. And one of those is the development, as you've described there, of lost cause narratives and culture, which is to say the organization of mostly white, for obvious reasons, Southerners in the South that are trying to construct a memory of the old South, of what it was before the Civil War, and about what the Confederacy was during the Civil War, and finally what happens in Reconstruction after the war. And so that's the sort of broad idea of what you're thinking about. And a lot of it is not just thinking about the past, but it's how to use the past for the cultural tensions of the present, and whether that's class, challenges to the patriarchy, challenges to white supremacy, all these things that are happening in what is often referred to during this period as the New South. Okay, so it's almost like making the Old South in the New South. That's a big part of what's going on here, and a lot of a big demographic within that kind of movement are Confederate veterans and veteran organizations, associations connected with them. And these organizations are often sponsors of these festivals for a start. They're putting up the money for some of them to go ahead. Often the musicians are themselves elderly Confederate veterans. Sometimes the audiences are Confederate veterans. This is entertainment for the elderly veteran contingents in different parts of the South. And also they're often fundraising events for Confederate veterans, which is something we may come back to. But, you know, there is a difference between the South and the North in this respect, in that following the Civil War, Union veterans were given a federal pension. And there was all kinds of support for them. But in the South, for obvious reasons, there was not that kind of support for Confederate veterans. So it was all a bit ad hoc. Some places had some money, but it was always not enough usually to get by, really. So one of my arguments is that these contests are a way for these veterans to actually earn a bit of money, quite an important part for some of them. And a good source, historical source we have here is applications for Confederate pensions. You can actually see some of these old fiddlers that are going to these contests having applied, often unsuccessfully, for Confederate pension, describing their disabilities, which have either come from the war or after the war. And so you can see that through their old age and through their disability, they are struggling to make ends meet. And also, I suppose, have some sort of dignity in later life. And that's what these old fiddlers contests can provide to a certain degree. But as well as that kind of more practical, again, sort of biomedical and social kind of political dimension, there is also the sort of symbolic value of these events for local communities. So as I said, it's a moment of tension in the South during these early decades of the 20th century. And the symbolic nature of having these older veterans, particularly when they have disabilities, which is something that I talk about in this article. When you see the empty sleeves of these people, it's what in disability studies is often called a narrative prosthesis, which is the idea that the disability comes to symbolize something for whatever kind of political, social cause. And in this case, it's that kind of incompletedness of the disabled older body that comes to stand in for this memory of the South that's being constructed. It's kind of the sacrifice of the empty sleeve is a really important symbol during this period. And you can see it within these kind of musical cultures. So a lot of these festivals do have one-armed fiddle players. It becomes a very common trope.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that right there is like a tangible demonstration of some of that stuff you were telling our listeners about at the beginning, about how these different disciplinary threads can help, like you said, make sense of these experiences in the past. So I appreciate you kind of giving us a case study to kind of manifest some of those things that you were spelling out for us at the beginning. And then there's a couple of people in your Southern Cultures piece, too, that we have to talk about. First of all, the gentleman that you mentioned towards the beginning, Frank Rayburn. So can you tell us about Frank and what we can learn about his story as well in terms of how disability plays out in roots music?
Yes, so Frank Rayburn, often called Uncle Frank Rayburn, was a one-armed banjo player who was born and lived in and around Charlotte, North Carolina, and particularly his archival record, I suppose, is most notable in the 1940s and 1950s. But he was born in 1881, so he was already an older man by the time we can kind of see his record. He lost his arm, which was his left arm, aged around 6, while he was chopping down a tree with his brother, which when I found that was the cause, it did make me think about the experience of living in rural life and the expectations of children as part of the family kind of labor unit. You know, you can see how that's where disability can kind of come from in those particular contexts. So again, it's quite a rural southern feature of his disability. And anyway, after his arm was amputated as a result of that injury, and as a child, he began to learn that music seems to have been around his home at that time. He begins to learn to play the banjo with his feet at first, and he mainly learns old mountain tunes, sacred songs, what we call folk songs of the tradition. And but then he also learns other ways. So it's not just playing with his feet, which itself was remarkably difficult. He also would, so it was his left arm, that you have to picture what this would look like. His left arm is missing. So he would often flip what would be a right-handed banjo upside down so that he could play with his right hand, hammering on and off, which itself is quite difficult. But he would also then later in his life develop a third way of playing, which was via a sort of a contraption that would be strapped to his leg, coming up. So you play the banjo right-handed, as one normally would if you were right-handed, but with the contraption, which is a kind of large metal sort of stick going up to bar chords, and then be able to finger pick with his remaining hand. So a variety of what we call in disability studies accommodations to disability, not just one, but various kinds. So a remarkable man in any ways. So the story about how I kind of came across him is in a way what the piece is about in the introduction in any case. So I first came to hear about him I was a doctoral research fellow at the Wilson Library in Chapel Hill in North Carolina, and I came across a photograph in a folklorist's, not a very famous folklorist's collection of what I eventually found out was Rayburn, but at the time it was just a photo of a one-armed banjo player with the stick, so you can kind of see this image. And I was really taken aback by this accommodation. And then a year or so later, I came across another folklorist that had encountered this same person, and through that chain, and then a third different person that had recorded Rayburn. So often, some context is that later in his life, in the late 40s and 50s. And early 60s as well, he would play on the street. So he was a street performer playing for change, and they get taken down to sort of downtown and perform. So many of these folklorists were young men. Sometimes they were working at radio stations or interested in folk cultures in North Carolina, and they would record him, photograph him, talk to him. And some of these photographs and recordings still exist. They are collected in archives now in the Library of Congress and elsewhere. But as I was encountering these folklorist encounters, sort of a bit of a meta experience in the archives here, you start to understand that there is a sort of what we refer to in disability studies as an ableist gaze, that the reason that these folklorists are interested is because of the disability more than anything else. And so you start to question, well, who was Rayburn? What was his interests? What was his voice? What was his musical voice as much as anything else? And so you start to think about what it must have been like to have been a disabled person, to have all of these people come and document you and ask you questions about your disability, and for your disability to be the main focus. And on that point, there is something I'm sure familiar to many listeners, but is a trope that comes up a lot in disability studies of the freak show. You know, this tradition of kind of variety show entertainment in which disabled people are made to be looked at, gawked at, laughed at mostly. And while this is not necessarily the extreme version of that, it is a sort of lighter version that still potentially, shapes his experience of music, of disability as well as anything else. So that story was a way to start to begin to unpack, well, what was this experience of having limb loss in the South? Because despite limb loss being something about the absence of something, it's really present across a lot of particularly old time and hillbilly music during the early 20th century. So Rayburn is just one example of these kinds of musicians.
Yeah, and I think that pairs well with the fiddling contest we were just talking about. So I think it's really fascinating how you've, in the article, kind of provided these different touch points and case studies for unpacking that. Rayburn kind of pairs well with another gentleman that you discuss later in the article, Emery Martin, who, to quote your article here, nurtured his public image as a disabled genius, end quote. So can you talk about what's going on with this musician, Emery Martin, how he was playing with his public image, and then also how did external factors play into that, like producers and radio stations. Are there certain things going on, like what you were talking about with Reborn, like the freak show narrative? What kind of tensions can be found in the Emery Martin case study?
Yeah, so it's interesting because Rayburn at one stage does have it seems he may have had a brief period performing over a North Carolina radio station. Now, this period, particularly starting in the 1920s and then by the 1940s and post-war period, these are established parts of Southern culture, is the phenomenon of barn dance radio shows. So most people will be familiar with the Grand Ole Opry, which began as one of these kinds of shows. But there were dozens of these all across the South and also in the Midwest as well, and then eventually going further out west. And these shows were kind of presenting a kind of cultural imaginary of what the barn dance of the past used to be, these kinds of rural get-togethers. But they were at the same time very artificial. The live shows had people dressing up in outfits that maybe weren't in fashion anymore. 19th century styles, but in the early 20th century. So it's a real kind of nostalgia entertainment. So Emery Martin comes in as an example of somebody, unlike Rayburn, who clearly had success within that particular genre of radio and musical entertainment. So Emery, unlike Frank, Emery was born with his limb loss. He was also missing an arm. So this kind of congenital anomaly is what we're talking about. And so from a very young age, he really just learns to play with his feet, and it's quite a skill that he's got. He can really, in ways that when you listen to recordings that exist, probably surpass Rayburn's talents, I suppose, and that's hence why he became such a success story. And he played on quite a few different shows during his early career, including traveling units. But he really comes to settle on the Renfrew Valley barn dance up in Kentucky. And it's there that he works with famous producer John Lair. John Lair was an interesting character, patron of many different early country musicians during this period. And it was an interesting guy in terms of the way he tried to get that balance between the kind of authenticity of the folk music being distributed across America as well as the South, but also the artificiality of it, that this was still a stage show, a variety show full of comics, entertainers. It wasn't just music going on there. And that's kind of where he obviously saw Emery fitting as part of that variety performance. Now, what's interesting was when I first came across reading particularly like newspaper reports and also because there are a lot of at Berea College, there are surviving archival recordings of Renfrew, so you can listen to how, for example, a producer like John Lair will introduce Emery at these shows in the 1940s and 1950s. And at first, I would have assumed that this was the same kind of freak show narrative that we've talked about before. But actually, what you get, both between him and between Emery Martin and John Lair, is a kind of presentation of his genius, of him being almost having a superpower by being able to do this. So the banjo is a very difficult instrument, and he's playing it with his feet. And not doing, because there were other banjo players that were one-armed that would often use quite extensive machines, basically, machinery kind of contraptions to then help them play. And it's always mentioned that Emery didn't do that he was like a kind of a real roots performer of this disabled one-armed banjo kind of tradition. I always find it quite interesting that was the way it was presented. Now, just to be very clear, that itself is a kind of ableist stereotype, that just being able to perform means you're a genius. I mean, obviously he put a lot of work into it and he was a remarkable musician in many ways, but to make it out to be a kind of superpower, it reminds us, I suppose, of lots of these kinds of X Factor style shows that we have, these talent shows today. You'll often get that overcoming narrative of a disabled person who has gone beyond, so to speak, their disability, which doesn't really get to the humanity or the talent of the person in question, because again, you're just focusing on the disability rather than the music, I suppose. And so it's a very interesting character for many different reasons. And again, another thing to highlight there, to really emphasize, is that because he was born with this disability, it makes it quite interesting that the issue, because there's a lot of associations during this period between hillbillies, kind of the Southern Appalachian culture, and disabilities might come from birth defects. And this really ties in with the eugenics movement of particularly the post-First World War era, which was very prominent in Southern medical schools and elsewhere in the US. So it's really fascinating that he doesn't get those associations, that really he is treated, he dresses in suits, he doesn't dress like a hillbilly. So it's a very interesting balancing act that he's doing there. And I suppose one issue with this is this kind of research, and this is a good case study for this kind of study, is that there is a lot of press representation of him. So we know a lot about how he was sold, how John Laird promoted him, and to some degree how he promoted himself, but there's less of his voice, to be perfectly honest, in a lot of these texts. So I was really amazed to come across a biography that was written by his wife, but it was clearly ghost written, so using her husband's testimony. And you get all sorts of detail about what it was like to be born one arm in the South during this period. He was born in Tennessee. There's a description of his mother's experience when she found out that her son was going to be born disabled. This is real for historians of disability. It's a really interesting resource that adds a lot to our understanding of these things. But these are kinds of rare texts. Often those voices are restricted by the ableist archive that we often work with.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting to hear methodologically, like some of the challenges that come for sure with kind of trying to make sense of these very specific threads of the past and like experiences. So that's really awesome that you were able to capture as much as you could in this piece, and I assume in your larger work as well, of Emery Martin and Frank Rayborn, whatnot. So that's really cool. I'll have to check out that biography. That sounds really interesting. So I know we've been talking a lot about like the Southern cultures piece, and we've talked about the fiddle contest, and then these two musicians, Frank and Emery. But is there anything else or anyone else that you want to bring up as part of that article, or that's part of your larger project?
One part of this study that I can only really touch, I suppose, near the end of the piece, is the experience of Black musicians and performance of Black music with limb loss. And to that degree, there was an interesting parallel, I suppose, between one-legged musicians. So these are often, again, the connection with homelessness, vagrancy, and performing street music is a big factor here. So Peg Leg Howe, many blues musicians we have that have this experience of having one leg. And he may use it as a part of their lyrics, for example. It's something we've not talked about as much so far, is about how musicians often through their lyrics or their choice of repertoire will play on their disability to varying degrees. And we have to have a sort of open-mindedness about why they might have chosen this particular song. So to give one example, there was a thread through many of the one-armed and one-legged musicians that I look at in the piece, that many of them at some stage were performers of the song John Henry. Now, from on the one hand, John Henry is a standard of the folk repertoire, blues repertoire of the South, so it's hardly surprising that a banjo player or fiddle player would be playing John Henry. On the other hand, the story of John Henry is, of course, of somebody, John Henry himself, going against insurmountable powers, which may be well seen as this kind of ableist society, that the disabled person may be seeing themselves in the John Henry kind of mode, using John Henry as an inspirational character. So these are the kind of issues that you're looking at when you're looking at the kinds of repertoire and performance of these, when you're unpacking the way they perform these kinds of styles. Another issue, I suppose, which I've not covered as much in the piece, but is how we think about the legacies of these, about disability and old age and aging in things like country music today. So the overcoming narrative is still very much there. There's occasional pop hits by country stars that are around friends with disability or their own disability that lean into these overcoming narratives that we've already seen over a century ago, still there in the early forms of the genre, and even institutional connections. So, for example, the connections between the country music industry and the military, and particularly with disabled veterans, is still a very, very strong one. And because of the high numbers of Southerners that serve in the military and therefore come back with disabilities from Iraq, Afghanistan, this means that this is a very big part of the country music industry today. And I suppose the kind of legacies of the freak show, are we still having this gaze upon disabled performers and disabled people in this kind of way? It's something to reflect upon as we go forward. And I suppose the final thing I would say is that it was a really fascinating piece to write in many ways and to research. But one of the nicest parts of it was I mentioned at the beginning one of the folklorists that documented Frank Rayburn, the one-armed banjo player we talked about at the beginning. I managed to actually reach out to him. He's still alive and kicking, and was a really interesting guy. So this is Charles D. Webb, who I mentioned in the piece. And so I managed to get in touch with him over a transatlantic call. And he was very, very kind and allowing me to use resources and talking to me a bit about what he can remember of Rayburn, which was, it was quite a few decades ago, but he still remembered him very fondly. And it was interesting because Charles himself had now he was older, I believe in his 80s. I've got that right. Excuse me, Charles, if you're listening. Who'd also taken up music himself in older age and was kind of interested in music and often thought about Rayburn's disability, particularly with disabled people in his own life, and what kind of model Rayburn is for a disabled person. And it really did make me think about the cyclical nature of history and what history can do, how it serves us today. So I think that's something I take away from this project, is that if you can have those kinds of conversations, it's a really important part of the work.
Yeah, thank you. And I think I appreciate you kind of bringing those threads into like more recent iterations of things like country music, and also like the meta-ness of you talking to the researcher who researched this gentleman, Frank, like you are. So I think that's really interesting to leave our listeners with, are some things to ponder for the present. So I appreciate you talking with us today on Take on the South.
Thank you so much for having me.
Listeners, just as a quick recap, this was an interview with our guest, Dr. Simon Buck. This is Emily Allen, and I'll catch you next time here on Take on the South.
That was our Take on the South. Let us know yours. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at U of SC South. Take on the South is produced by Matt Simmons of the Institute for Southern Studies. Special thanks to Professor Dave Garner of the University of South Carolina School of Music for composing our music. Tune in next time for another Take on the South.